Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters.
One of the things that we as humans have been doing for thousands and thousands of years is putting all of our frustrations onto a scapegoat. So a group of people decide that somebody is responsible for the problems of their community or their group, and they take out all of their frustrations on the scapegoat. Okay, the first example I want to talk about when I think about scapegoating in Indigenous communities is one in which there was a chief who in his earlier life was deeply into alcohol, and he had his drinking buddies, and then he decided to get sober. He was really quite an exceptional chief. He was able to establish economic initiatives and do a lot for his community, and with his sobriety, he was able to really excel as a leader. So his old drinking buddies started to have this uneasy feeling. Who was he that he wasn't drinking anymore? And they must have felt it reflected badly on them that they were still drinking. And so they had these frustrations around them. So a whole group of them picked him up at one time and took him somewhere. And a number of them held him down on the floor, and one of them put a funnel into his mouth and forced alcohol down his throat. So that's an example of scapegoating, a group of people taking out their frustrations on one individual in a way that was highly destructive and demeaning. Another one that was more violent was this person who saved up his money, and he bought an RV, and on the reserve he made native fast food, so bannock burgers and so on, and it was really successful, and for a time everybody in the community loved it because here was this food outlet on their community. And then people started talking, who does he think he is he better than all the rest of us? And then there was graffiti sprayed on his RV, and this is a form of symbolic scapegoating, if you like, of doing something graphically to put somebody down. And then the next thing was it was set on fire, and so his whole dream was gone because it was burnt down, and it had to do with this sort of mumbling and grumbling within the community of who does he think he is he better than us, and so on, just because he had saved up his money and taken initiative. So he was set apart, if you like, because of his success. The other involves a young woman on a reserve in Alberta who wasn't involved with boys, and she didn't take drugs, and she studied hard. She was very good looking, and she was really good at school, and she had these high aspirations for what she might want to do. And so a group of her peers caught a hold of her, held her down, and cut up her face. And her face then was scarred, and so she was so brutally violated that she ended up going to Edmonton and ended up as a prostitute on the streets of Edmonton. So these are three examples of what happens within a closed system, and one person might be outstanding because they've gotten over a challenge like drinking, or they've excelled, or they seem to be a little bit better, and a group of people takes it out on them. So René Girard, a French thinker working in the United States, discovered this phenomenon, and he studied it in so many different settings. He saw it in literature, he saw it in the story of Jesus, he saw it in anthropology, and woven into so many cultures. And so there's a whole international group of scholars that have been working on studying this phenomenon, but it's becoming really clear that this is something that happens all the time. So you can think about bullying from that perspective, even cyberbullying, and you can see how at a national level, somebody, a leader might say, all of our problems are because of those people. So in the case of Hitler, it was because of the Jewish people. And so he was able to mobilize the German people in a grand scapegoating action that tried to eliminate the Jewish people. But he wasn't the first to pick on the Jews. Back in the 1300s, as Girard points out, there was a plague, like our pandemic right now. And they didn't know about germs. They didn't know how plagues worked, how they were passed on. And so there's a document in France that says the plague is because of the Jews. And we know, and they said, oh, the Jews are poisoning the wells, or the Jews have an evil eye. So we know these things are totally false. They have nothing to do with the plague. But people found a rationale because they wanted to blame somebody because so many people were dying. And they were all frustrated. And out of that frustration, they said, oh, let's blame somebody, and they can't blame everybody. So who is a group that is vulnerable, or who? And they said the Jews have the doctors, they have the physicians, so they would know how to poison the wells. And we know, of course, there was no poison, and we know, of course, the Jews didn't do this. It's absolutely false, but nonetheless, there's a clear document back then that says the Jews are to blame for the plague. So this matter of blaming somebody for one's own frustrations is part of that projection onto somebody else, a reason for your problems. So when we look at who is a scapegoat, Girard has a book called The Scapegoat, and he also has a book called Violence and the Sacred. And in these two books in particular, he really develops this notion of how does scapegoating work. But when we ask the question of who might be a scapegoat, we want somebody who we can call illegitimate in some way, because we want to be able to blame them somehow for this. So we try to think about something about them that will make them illegitimate. And so when Donald Trump tried to make scapegoats of the immigrants to justify him building a big wall, he was saying, well, the immigrants are responsible for crime and for a number of other things. And people who have studied all of this show that is patently false, that the immigrants make a big contribution to US society, and the criminal dimensions of the immigrant population are lower than in the general population, for instance. But nonetheless, a lot of people believe that. They said, we're frustrated, we've got so much crime, and if we can blame somebody, that's who we can blame. So first of all, scapegoats can be illegitimate. Second of all, they are different, because if somebody stands out as being different, then they can be blamed. And sometimes the difference has to do with somebody at the bottom of society, people who are poor. Sometimes it has to do with racial distinctions. Sometimes it has to do with culture. And sometimes it has to do with people at the top of society, where kings and princes. Think about the French Revolution, where the people who were being killed off were all the aristocrats. And likewise during the Russian Revolution, and they chose to kill all the wealthy farmers, for instance, because they thought they were to blame for the oppression of the people. So this matter of banding together, all together against one particular target, is about choosing somebody who's different. So I remember in the schoolyard, there was a fellow, his name was Paul, and he was intellectually challenged, like he had really significant learning disabilities, and he could easily be taken advantage of. And I can remember people egging him on to do some ridiculous task as a way of, and everybody could be united in taking out their frustrations on Paul, who was different. Then scapegoats are also people who are vulnerable, because the one thing you don't want to have happen is to have a scapegoat that fights back and is stronger than you. Then it's not going to work. And so you want somebody vulnerable, but you also want to have a scapegoat who's powerful enough to blame for all of your problems. So, you can. So these four things seem to help us identify who might be a scapegoat in any potential situation, and then it comes about in a context where people are frustrated when there are difficult life circumstances. Now, there's another aspect to scapegoating that became really important in Girard's study of it, and that is that after a scapegoat action, and we're talking about scapegoating starting in a society, an ancient society where people were living off the land, where their very existence could be vulnerable, and where the conflict within a community might, if they started being violent with one another, they might kill off enough people that the community itself might not be viable. So the stakes were really high. And in this circumstance where there's extreme frustration and yet a realization we can't let the conflict get out of hand, it's like there's this intuitive sense that, oh, if we take out all of our conflict on one scapegoat, it'll make a difference. And so you can think about stoning as being a violent scapegoating in which one person is killed by everybody throwing stones at them. So what happens after the stoning? Well, everybody's had a release of energy through throwing all the stones. They've all been worked up into a rage where they're really angry. And then all of a sudden at the end, this person is dead. There's a pile of stones over them, and the people feel at peace. They've worked together on something. And all of a sudden the people that had animosity toward one another within the community, they are now at peace. And they're in awe, like all of a sudden, everything's different. Why is that? Well, the only person that can be credited is a scapegoat. And so this becomes the beginning of mythologies where the scapegoat, who at one point is the victim of violence, then later becomes deified. And so the primitive stories about certain gods doing such and such derive from an experience of scapegoating. And so Girard has looked at myths from around the world, and inevitably there's a story that has to do with somebody being banished or something happening to somebody who's eliminated somehow or other. So a lot of the marks of the scapegoating are covered up, they're hidden in the stories. But if you do a careful analysis, as Girard has done, you see pretty clearly that these stories have their roots in this scapegoating action. And then when people have wanted to say, oh, we would like to do this repeatedly, we'd like to have this sense of peace among us, then they develop sacrificial systems. And so the animals that are sacrificed then become surrogate scapegoats. And it's the whole community together who's part of this ritual where they kill an animal, and that's supposed to relieve them of their of the problems. So this makes it all become very real when you think about the impact of this kind of action. At the time when I was introduced to Girard's thought initially, I had been working in the criminal justice system, and certain people pointed out that, oh, there's this interesting thinker, and his ideas might have to do with criminal justice and understanding what's going on in criminal justice. And so I started to recognize, first of all, that a lot of crimes might be the right result of some kind of scapegoat action. So at that level, you can see it. But then I started to see at a more profound level that the criminal justice system could be seen as a scapegoating or sacrificial system, because I'd been studying and analyzing the criminal law review, and the Sentencing Commission report points out that of all the crimes that are committed, only a tiny percentage result in a conviction. So just a tiny number of, and just a small number of convictions result in a prison sentence. So you start to say, who is primarily represented in our prison system? And you see here in Canada that it's in large measure Indigenous people, and in the United States it's overwhelmingly Black people. Does it mean that they've committed more crimes? No, doesn't mean that at all, because there are a lot of crimes that people get away with. Think about drugs, where, when marijuana was criminalized, and a lot of drugs are still criminalized. Think about all the wealthy people that take cocaine, for instance. They can get away with it. Nobody's going to come into their house and search for cocaine. They don't have to steal to get the money for it. They've got lots of money. They can buy it easily. And so they're not going to get arrested or convicted for drug possession, for instance. But somebody who's poor on the street, who has to steal to get money to get cocaine, you get the picture. They are the ones that are going to be arrested, and they don't have the money to hire expensive lawyers. And so they're really quite susceptible to being arrested and put into prison. And you can think also of the people with mental illness problems. So of all the people who commit crimes, if you have a problem with mental illness, you can't control yourself, so you can't hide as well what you've done. And so the chances are much better that you are going to be caught and convicted of a crime. And everybody, so often politicians run on a law and order kind of ticket, and people have this fear. This is a threat to their identity needs, if you like. They have this fear. They're insecure because they feel like there's crime out there. And so the law and order politicians sort of say, well, we're going to come and we're going to clean things up. And by cleaning things up, it usually boils down to, we're going to find lots and lots of people at the poor end of the spectrum, and we're going to lock these people up. And then everybody's going to feel better about themselves. And so here you have this sense of community peace. We feel better about ourselves because we're better than the people that are left out, that are locked up. And we've come together and we've made society safer. So that was where I was first trying to apply scapegoat theory. And I wrote a monograph called Scapegoats, the Bible and Criminal Justice, interacting with René Girard. And that's where I first started writing about some of these concepts. Well, it matters because first and foremost, it matters because when you become aware of this and you open your eyes to it, you start to see how many people are harmed, how many people are violated, how many lives are messed up because of scapegoat actions. So some of these can be in the workplace, where somebody might be a little bit different, or people are frustrated and they want to get rid of somebody, and so they pick on somebody and harass them to the point where they have to leave the job, for instance, and their lives are devastated. So that's at a primary level that it matters because of the people that are hurt. The stakes go up then when you think of collective scapegoating, and you think about wars where identity groups are highly where there are clear demarcations of identity groups where people are set apart or they're different. You can think about the Roma people in Europe, for instance, or in Africa. You think of instances where there are take Rwanda and the time of the genocide. The Hutus in Rwanda in 1994 were blaming the Tutsis for all of their problems, and they had a fear that the Tutsis might be coming back and that they would dominate them. So they had a whole narrative that was against the Tutsis, and the leaders were able to galvanize the whole Hutu or a big part of the Hutu population, certainly not all the people, but a large number of people, into this very passionate and very violent situation where they killed at least 800,000, possibly over 1 million people in roughly 100 days and mainly with machetes. So people were worked up into a frenzy, and you can see it clearly as a scapegoat action with the idea you eliminate all the Tutsis and the world will be a better place, kind of thing. So the stakes become really high at all these different levels, from the personal to the collective. But then it becomes important for us as individuals, because we could ask, okay, think about it. Have you ever been a scapegoat? Have people ever collectively turned on you? Have they ridiculed you, or have they been violent toward you? How has that felt for you? So we can think of it that way, but then you can ask the other question. How many of you have ever been part of a group that really made life difficult for somebody else? How many of you have been part of a group that was scapegoating? And then when you ask that question, you start to get a kind of realization that none of us are completely exempt from any of this, even in families, because sometimes there might be one member of the family that's really picked on, or social workers have talked about how in a dysfunctional family, everybody talks about the problem child, and they take the problem child out of the family, and it doesn't take very long, and the whole thing repeats itself because they don't have good ways of communicating or working together, and so on. So you start to say, if we're involved in this, how does an awareness of this help us to start changing what we're doing? And that's when it matters, because then we can start to see scapegoating as it gets started. We can start to see how we might be sucked in. We can see how we might feel like we want to do this. Now, at the current time, if you really want to feel what scapegoating action is like, you just think about the videos of the people who went into the Capitol and chanting USA, and then something about getting rid of Pence and so on. But you can see the passion of that crowd, the passion of the mob, and the passion is directed toward scapegoats, legislators whom they blame for, they believe the lie that Donald Trump has given them, that the election was stolen, so this legitimates what they're doing, and they're just passionate about getting to the lawmakers, and had they actually captured Pence or some of the others, the chances are pretty good that they would have killed them. So we would have had a literal scapegoat killing going on. But even apart from whether it would have ended in the killing, we don't know for sure whether it would have. But to feel the passion behind a scapegoat action, you just have to listen to the chants of those crowds and see how they just were carried away with all of those terrible actions. And there could be a sort of a symbolic scapegoating. So ransacking a room and throwing all the papers on the floor and so on. Those are all part of the violence associated with directing your frustrations onto a scapegoat victim. In the future, we can see that that people are going to be very frustrated, potentially through the effects of global warming, through necessities of life not being available. And as they are frustrated and as they experience a lack, they're going to want to blame somebody. And so that's one dimension of why it's important for the future, because this could lead to either individual or collective scapegoating. They want to find someone to hold responsible in a very particular kind of way, and they think if they can just eliminate whatever group it is, they can solve the problem. So we can just think back a couple of years to when we had the 99% protesting against the 1% who own so much of the wealth in the world, and the 99% who don't have so much. And in a sense, the protests were almost a symbolic form of saying the big problem is this huge inequality. It didn't turn out into violent scapegoating action. None of the wealthy were ever killed. There was very minimal damage to any property. It wasn't an all-out scapegoating. But suppose it got to the point where passions were whipped up, where there were even greater inequalities and a great sense of injustice. That's another thing. The other reason it matters in the future is that we've had a recent trend toward electing leaders in a number of different countries who have had a tendency to come down hard on groups of people and in a sense gain popularity through a contrived scapegoating by saying in Europe, the immigrants from the Middle East or from Syria, or the large number of immigrants are responsible for our problems, or our very noble and tradition of who we are as French people, for instance, is diminished somehow by these others who have come in. And you could play that out in France, in Germany, in Hungary, in Poland, in so many places. And so if you have leaders that give voice to this, to what people are thinking and their desire they feel something's changing, they feel like life is worse for them, and there's a tendency then to just say, we've got to find somebody to blame. And so you get these power-hungry leaders who use the frustrations of people to direct the energy toward particular groups, like Donald Trump did in relation to immigrants and coming in from Mexico in a particular kind of way. So an awareness of how this works can play a big role. The other situation that I think is particularly important in this regard are closed systems. That is, communities that are well-defined and in some ways where there's a big boundary, so that you have a closed community. And closed communities lend themselves to scapegoating because everything gets amplified within this closed community. There isn't an outlet. If you have a situation where lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds and they're all interacting, there might be a slight tendency to say, oh, what about them? But then you're interacting with so many others and you forget about that. And so there's never a focused scapegoating thing. But if you think about an Indigenous reserve that's isolated, like movement and openness dissipate scapegoating because things can change and you're not bottled up and you don't have the same buildup of frustration. But if you're in a fixed community like a reserve and there's not a lot of free movement and a lot of interaction with lots of other people, you can very easily get to the point of blaming somebody within your own community. And so if we're going to move toward a fractured society and fractured societies where people for their own self-preservation or for their own security move into tightly knit and controlled kinds of communities, we can anticipate intense scapegoating increasing with that phenomenon. I guess it's obvious the theory around scapegoating has really come about primarily through René Girard, and the people who studied under him and the people who have studied his work have really made a huge contribution to our understanding of how scapegoating works. I guess another author, because if we don't want to limit it just to René Girard, in this book Awakening, which I edited together with Gloria, my lifelong partner, there's a chapter by Sander Goodhart. And Sander Goodhart was the fourth person to do his PhD under René Girard. And in a different volume, Sandy has developed this idea of how an ancient text in the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 52:53, really describes the phenomenon of the scapegoat from the point of view of the victim. So all we like sheep have gone astray, and we have laid on him the sin, the problems of us all. And so I think it's interesting that there are these ancient texts that show a certain wisdom in how we can see how scapegoats can be innocent and how a collective can bring out all their frustrations on this victim. And so while Girard has done some studying of this, Sandy, who's a professor of Jewish studies at Purdue University, brings a depth of understanding to some of these texts that is really profound.